Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about India. Specifically, it's kind of a look at the political and economic scene over there. And we've got a super interesting source to work with. It's the speech Prime Minister Modi gave recently.
Yeah, this speech.
He talks about Naxalism in India. And, you know, some of the things he said were pretty surprising, I got to say.
Absolutely. I think his comments about Naxalism possibly moving from the rural areas into the cities, that was kind of a new take. And then especially that bit about how it might be connected to certain political parties, that really caught my attention.
I know, right? Okay, so Modi starts off talking about all the economic growth that's been happening in India, how they went from the 11th largest economy to the 5th.
Huge jump.
And they're aiming for the 3rd spot, which is pretty amazing. He actually uses this term, impactful governance, to describe their approach over the last, decade or so.
Right, so he's really drawing a line between, maybe how things were done before and this new way of governing that's focused on actual results and actually making stuff happen. And you see this idea reflected in a lot of the initiatives he talks about, like the Swamitva scheme.
Right, and at first it sounds like a technical thing, but it's actually a really cool example of this impactful governance that he's talking about. So they're using drones, right, to map and document property rights for people in rural areas. And that could be huge. I mean, just think about it. When people have clear ownership of their land, they can invest in it, they can improve it, and it really boosts the whole, economic activity in those areas.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a really important point to highlight because there's this idea that if you empower people economically, that can actually help reduce the appeal of things like Naxalism in the first place. Because, if people feel like they have a stake in the system and they're actually benefiting from it, they're less likely to, be drawn to these more radical ideologies.
That's a great point.
So, yeah, you could even look at this scheme as, a way to address the root cause, not just the symptoms,
So that's really fascinating. So Modi, he's presenting this picture of India growing really fast and the government's actively working to make sure everybody benefits, even in those rural areas. But then he brings up this issue of Naxalism.
Right. And I guess for anybody who might not be familiar with that term, Naxalism is basically this long-running internal security problem that India's been dealing with for a while. It's, it's often associated with armed uprisings in rural areas, often fueled by, socioeconomic grievances. So it's not a simple issue. It's got deep roots.
Right. It's complicated. But here's where it gets really interesting. Modi says they've made some serious progress in fighting Naxalism in those rural areas. The number of districts affected has dropped way down.
Oh, wow.
And he says it's because the government's been focusing on grassroots governance and development programs.
Right. So basically he's saying by tackling some of the underlying issues that fuel this whole thing, they've been able to kind of push back against Naxalism in those rural areas. But then, and this is where things take a turn, he starts talking about how Naxalism is changing. It's shifting towards the cities now.
Yeah. That's what got me too. He even calls it urban Naxalism. And he seems really, really worried about it. He's basically saying okay, yeah, we've made some progress in the countryside, but now we've got this whole new threat and it might even be trickier to deal with. And he doesn't stop there. He even hints that this urban Naxalism is finding its way into some political parties.
Yeah, and that's where it gets a little controversial. He claims that there's this political party, and it's one that's usually associated with Gandhian principles, nonviolence, all that. But now, according to him, they're starting to sound a lot like these urban Naxals.
It's pretty bold, I gotta say. Now, before we go any further, I think it's super important for us to be, completely neutral here.
Sure.
We don't want to name any specific party. We're just trying to lay out what Modi said, not endorse anything.
Yeah, for sure. Our job is just to kind of break down this speech and let you guys decide what you think. What's really interesting, though, is that Modi doesn't just mention this connection to political parties. He goes on to say that these urban Naxals are actively working against India's development and, their cultural heritage too.
Right, like he paints them as, this anti-progress force, almost like they're trying to undermine all the positive things that are happening in India.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty complicated picture, isn't it? On one hand, you've got India experiencing all this economic growth. They're aiming for, global leadership, but on the other hand, you've got this threat of Naxalism that might be evolving. It might be spreading to the cities, and it could even be like influencing politics.
Yeah, it's like this tension between, all this progress and, these internal security concerns. It's a thread that runs through like the whole speech.
Yeah.
And it kind of feels like he's saying that India's journey isn't going to be, all smooth sailing, and they need to stay alert to these challenges and, present a united front.
Yeah, it's like he's trying to get the whole country to like celebrate their achievements, but also be cautious about these threats from within.
Exactly. And that kind of duality is what makes this speech so interesting to unpack. It raises a lot of questions about how India is going to handle all of this, these competing forces moving forward.
Okay, so we've kind of set the stage here. We've got economic growth, the changing face of Naxalism, and then this possible link to politics.
Right.
So where do we go from here?
Well, I think we got to delve deeper into how Modi talks about like India's overall growth story.
But despite all these challenges he brings up, he's still super optimistic about India's future. Remember that part where he talks about, India getting rid of that old image of being a country that would sink and take the world down with it?
Yeah. Powerful imagery.
It's like he's saying that era's over.
For sure.
Yeah.
He's presenting a whole new image for India, like one where they're not just rising themselves, but they're helping the whole world grow. They're inspiring other countries. And he even uses some concrete examples, like how India has gone from importing stuff to exporting stuff, in all sorts of sectors, like even toys and weapons.
Exactly. He's talking about, accomplishments, self-reliance. He's projecting this image of, strength and progress really on a global scale.
Yeah.
He's definitely trying to change the way the world sees India. Yeah, and it's not just talk. He's got the numbers to back it up. Remember
Right.
that part where he mentions how back in 2007, India's whole GDP for the year was like 1 lakh crore, and now they reached that same level of economic activity in just 1 quarter. I mean, that's pretty mind-blowing when you think about how fast things are changing.
Really drives the point home.
And he also touches on, opening up some sectors like space and nuclear energy to private companies, which is a big deal. It shows they're pushing for innovation and even more growth.
Definitely.
So it seems like, he's trying to find this balance.
Mhm.
He's acknowledging these challenges, especially this whole like evolving Naxalism thing. But he's also emphasizing India's progress, their potential, all that.
And that balance is, exactly what makes this speech so interesting to analyze. It highlights all these, complex realities that India is facing, and it really sets the stage for some big questions about where they're headed. It really does make you think, like, how is this shift in Naxalism, going from the countryside to the cities, how's that going to affect India's chances of actually reaching those ambitious goals that Modi laid out, right? Like, can a country that's dealing with all these security threats really, reach its full potential economically?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? It's almost like, this problem inside the country, this internal challenge, it could hold India back, even if the economy is doing well on paper. Like, how do you attract foreign investment? How do you project this image of stability when you have all this, stuff simmering under the surface?
Exactly. And it's not just about the direct economic effects either. Modi seems really worried about the ideological influence of these urban Naxals. Like he suggests that they're, actively trying to block India's development and undermine their cultural heritage. It's like they're pushing a worldview that goes against like the whole idea of progress in India.
Yeah.
So it's not just about like physical disruptions. It's about like this battle of ideas, a clash of narratives happening right inside India.
Okay, so let's talk about this whole urban Naxal thing a little more. Like what exactly is Modi talking about here? It's not like there are like, armed groups running around in Mumbai or Delhi, right?
You're right to ask that. Yeah, I mean the term urban Naxal, it's a loaded term and it's often used in a way that's kind of open to interpretation. It's not really about, literal fighting in the streets. It's more about people or groups who are like promoting these radical ideas, maybe disrupting social harmony or opposing, what they see as like oppressive structures in the government, often doing it under the guise of activism or intellectual debate. Yeah.
So it's more about like their ideology and their influence rather than like actual violence, right?
Exactly.
Defense.
And that's what makes it so tricky to handle. It's not something you can just, throw the police at and solve it. You need a more nuanced approach, something that addresses those root causes and offers people, different perspectives, different narratives to consider.
I see. So Modi's worried that these urban
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Operating in these intellectual and political spaces, they might gain enough influence to like disrupt India's progress from within.
Yeah, that seems to be the heart of his argument.
Yeah.
He even suggests that this influence is already starting to seep into political parties. Maybe shaping their platforms, their policies, and he thinks this could slow down growth or even create instability. Remember, he mentioned that political party that used to be like totally against Naxalism, but now, according to him, they're basically echoing those same views.
Yeah.
It's almost like he's talking about like this creeping ideological takeover.
I'm not totally sold on that. I've looked into that party he's talking about and their position on things like development and social justice. It's more complex than Modi's making it sound. Like they talk about inclusive growth. They talk about protecting the environment. They talk about tackling inequality. All those things. It's not like those are automatically anti-progress ideas, right?
That's a fair point. I mean, and it just goes to show how important it is to think critically about the information you're getting, even if it's coming from someone as important as the prime minister. He's definitely presenting this issue in a way that supports his own goals, right? So it's crucial to consider other perspectives, other interpretations.
Okay, so we've got this complex situation, right? We've got economic growth. We've got these, security threats that seem to be changing. We've got like these ideological battles, all happening at the same time. How do you think this is all going to affect where India goes in the future? Like, what are some of the possible scenarios we could be looking at here?
Well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? It's hard to say for sure, but let's think about some possibilities. If this whole urban Naxalism thing, if it really gains traction, if it starts to like really influence the political conversation, it could lead to more unrest. Maybe political gridlock or even a shift in priorities, away from economic growth.
So you're saying like India's economic miracle, it could get derailed not by like something from outside, but by problems within the country, by these ideological struggles.
That's one possibility, yeah, and it could affect India's, it's standing on the world stage too. Remember how Modi talked about, how India's shedding that old image. Well, if the world starts to see India as a place that's struggling with instability and all these ideological battles, it could scare off foreign investors. It could damage partnerships, and ultimately, hurt India's chances of becoming a global leader.
It's almost like, this internal problem could end up undermining the whole story Modi's trying to tell about India. Instead of seeing India as this rising power, the world might start to see them as a country that's divided, that's struggling to live up to its potential.
Yeah, exactly, and that's a risk that Modi seems to be very aware of. I think that's why he's trying to frame this issue in such strong, such black and white terms. It's like he's presenting it as this battle for the soul of India.
It's a powerful message for sure, but is it really an accurate picture of what's going on, or is he maybe exaggerating the threat, to try to consolidate his power, to try to silence anyone who disagrees with him?
That's a good question, and it speaks to this bigger challenge we all face. How do we make sense of information in a world where political leaders are constantly using these narratives, these stories, to try to push their own agendas? It's up to us, as informed citizens, to really look at these narratives, to consider different perspectives, and in the end, come to our own conclusions.
As we're talking about all this, something's kind of striking me. The way Modi talks about how some groups, even some political parties, seem to be like echoing the same kind of talk as these urban Naxals he's so worried about. It's almost like he's drawing a parallel between them and the challenges of Naxalism itself, you know?
Yeah. I see what you mean. Yeah, there's definitely this undercurrent of frustration in the way he talks about how, how some people, some groups seem to be, not just disagreeing with his policies, but actively, working against India's progress. It's like he's saying, hey, we're trying to build this new India, but there are forces out there, both inside and outside the country, that are trying to hold us back,
Yeah, and that's a really powerful message, especially when you consider the context of the speech, where he's also talking about all these achievements, all these, global ambitions. He's basically framing this whole situation as a battle between ideologies. It's like India's progress versus these forces that want to undermine it.
Yeah, definitely. It adds a whole other layer to this whole discussion, doesn't it? We've got the economic stuff, we've got the security concerns, and now we've got this whole, ideological dimension too. And that's why this topic is so, so fascinating to really dig into. It's not just about, understanding the facts on the ground. It's about, understanding those deeper narratives, those motivations that are, at play behind the scenes. It's about recognizing how, politics and economics and social dynamics, how they're all, intertwined, and how they're all shaping where India's headed.
So where do we go from here? What do you think our listeners should take away from this deep dive?
I think the biggest takeaway is that, India's at a really crucial point in its history. It's a country that's on the rise, but it's also facing, these really complex challenges that are going to, require some careful, some delicate handling. The decisions they make in the next, few years, they're going to have a huge impact on India's future,
Sure.
both within the country and on the global stage.
It's like we're watching this real-time experiment, this real-time case study in how a nation balances, this desire for growth, this ambition with the need to address, internal divisions and external pressures.
Exactly. And it's a case study that has, global implications. The world's watching, to see how India handles all of this, and the lessons they learn, they could have, far-reaching consequences.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot more to this story than meets the eye. What really stands out to you as we kind of dig into all these complexities?
It really is. Yeah, it's like these two different stories, competing with each other. One's all about hope and the other's all about worry.
Exactly. And it's hard to know which one's going to win out in the end, right?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, you have this image of India as like a tech superpower, right? A rising star on the global stage, a symbol of progress and all that. But then at the same time, you have these anxieties about unrest, about, these ideological divisions, and the possibility that all this could actually like derail their progress.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes this whole discussion so interesting. It's not just a simple story of good versus bad or right versus wrong. It's about, dealing with these really complicated realities, recognizing the potential, but also the risks, and understanding that progress doesn't always happen in a straight line.
Exactly. And that even when you have this rapid growth, there are still these really deep-rooted issues that need to be addressed.
I think that's such an important point. We often get caught up in these grand narratives of progress, and we forget that real change it's messy. There are always going to be competing forces pulling in different directions.
Right.
It's not just about hitting those economic targets. It's about building a society that's inclusive, that's fair, and that can actually withstand those pressures, those challenges that come along.
Yeah, and that's where this whole conversation about urban Naxalism gets really interesting. Because whether or not you agree with how Modi's describing it, it forces us to think about some really tough questions.
Yeah.
Questions about dissent, about ideology, about the limits of tolerance in a democratic society. When does criticism become something dangerous? How do we balance the need for security with the need to protect those fundamental freedoms?
Right.
These are questions that India is wrestling with right now, and the answers are going to have an impact way beyond India.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. As you were talking about that, something you said kind of clicked for me. I think back to how Modi talked about India, shedding that old stereotype, the one where they were seen as a country that would, sink and take the world down with it. It was this really powerful rejection of a negative image, right? It was like this declaration that India was rising, they were ready to contribute to global growth, all that.
Yeah.
But now, with all this talk about urban Naxals and these internal threats, it's almost like he's creating a new kind of bogeyman, a new way to define what's holding India back.
It's a really interesting point. It's like he shifted the focus, right, from this external threat, like global perception, economic stagnation, all that, to this internal one. And that shift has big implications for how they deal with these challenges.
Yeah.
If the problem is seen as something coming from outside, the solution might be to project strength, to prove everyone wrong,
Right.
But if the problem is seen as something rotten on the inside, then the solution might be more about control, about, getting rid of the elements that are seen as undesirable.
And that's where things get really, really tricky because who gets to decide what constitutes an urban Naxal? It's so subjective, it's so open to interpretation, and it could easily be used to, silence people who just disagree. It really raises some concerns about, freedom of speech, about, it maybe even some authoritarian tendencies,
It's a tough balance to strike, and this tension between security and freedom, it's something that democracies all around the world are grappling with. How do you protect people from real threats without, undermining the very values that make your society what it is? There's no easy answer.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into Modi's speech, I guess we're left with more questions than answers. We've talked about the economic optimism, the changing security threats, the ideological battles, and all these different narratives that are kind of shaping where India is right now and where they might be headed. It's clear that they're at a really important crossroads,
Absolutely.
They have all of these incredible opportunities, but they're also facing some really serious challenges.
And maybe as you continue to follow India's story, maybe think about this. How's this balancing act, between progress and security, between being open and being more controlled? How is that going to play out in the years to come?
Yeah.
Will India become a model for inclusive growth and democratic resilience?
Right.
Or will it kind of, give in to these pressures of division and maybe even authoritarianism?
Only time will tell, really.
So much to think about, right?
Yeah. And that's what I love about these deep dives. They open our eyes to new ways of looking at things. They challenge our assumptions, and they often leave us with more questions than we started with. But those questions, they're what make us want to learn more, to engage with the world in a deeper way. So until next time, keep those minds curious and keep those conversations going.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.